Hi everyone. This week we're going to talk about Judges through Esther. Now, these books in the Old Testament are known as the historical books in your English Old Testament. Um, some of these books are actually not in this order in the Hebrew Bible. However, uh, they are in this order in your English Bible, and so that's the way that we're going to talk about them. And basically, what you need to know as far as historical background, timeline, etc., is that these books, Joshua through Esther, now remember, we already talked about Esther last week, about Joshua, but nevertheless, Joshua through Esther cover the time period from when Israel enters the land in Joshua, the promised land of Canaan, to when they are exiled and about to return and start returning in Ezra, Nehemiah, and then also Esther has to deals with the historical context of Israel in exile. So Israel enters the land in Joshua. They conquer most of the land, but they leave some of it unconquered. In Judges, they fail to finish the task. And over again in Judges, they sin, they don't conquer the land, they turn away from God, they turn to idols, and they fail in their task of conquering the land, of living rightly before the Lord. In 1st and 2nd Samuel, Israel asks for a king. They're first given Saul, but then David is anointed by the Lord to be king. In 1st and 2nd Kings, Solomon takes over David's son. In First Kings and Second Kings, Solomon builds the temple, the first 11 chapters, and in First Kings, in the first 11 chapters, Solomon is king, and then from there on in First Kings, everything goes bad. Solomon falls into idolatry, and specifically through marrying foreign women, and he worships their gods. And after that, the line of kings gets worse and worse and worse. To make a long story short, which we'll go through in more detail as we go through this slide show, um, Israel splits into two kingdoms. The northern kingdom is still called Israel. The southern kingdom is called Judah. Israel, the northern kingdom, is very, very bad, and they are destroyed in, before the southern kingdom of Judah. Judah is destroyed as well in 586 BC by Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar takes away what's left of Judah, the southern kingdom, to Babylon. Israel had already been conquered by Assyria, and they have already been taken into exile. And so the whole nation of Israel, both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, is in exile. After Second Kings, we have First and Second Chronicles, which also details that time period. And then we have Ezra, Nehemiah, and in Ezra, Nehemiah, King Cyrus, king of Persia, begins to allow the Israelites to return to their land. And then finally, we have Esther, which is also another story of the Israelites in exile under the king of Persia. And so what we have in these books is this part of the story of Israel. In Genesis through Deuteronomy, they've started with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They've been in slavery in Exodus. Moses brought them out of slavery. They wandered in the wilderness because of their sin for 40 years. The second generation of Israel is prepared in Deuteronomy to enter the land. And then in Joshua through Esther, we have them entering the land, falling into sin, getting a king, falling into more sin, and then eventually going into exile. And in Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, we begin to see the promise of return to the land. Okay, so that's the broad outline of these books. Now let's walk through them in a little bit more detail. First of all, we have Joshua, which again we talked about last week, and this is known. The book of Joshua is known to be in the pre-exilic time period of Israel. This means that Joshua is written about Israel before they went into exile. Okay, and going into exile refers to the fact that Israel is conquered by Assyria, Judah is conquered by the Babylonians, and they are taken out of their land and into a foreign land. So that's what exile means. We talked about Joshua last week. Joshua deals with Israel conquering the land, apportioning it by tribe, and then Joshua encouraging them to be faithful at the end, and also it records Joshua's death at the end of the book of Joshua. Now, even in the book of Joshua, everything is not perfect. Israel doesn't conquer the land fully. There are some mistakes. They don't follow God's orders to the letter. And so even in Joshua, even when things are supposedly going well, we see signs that things might not continue to go well for Israel. And at the end of the book of Joshua, in Joshua 24, verse 14, Joshua tells the Israelites, he says, "Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Okay, Joshua says, he's at the end of his life, he's encouraging Israel to stay faithful. They've primarily been faithful in the book of Joshua to conquer the land, to go in and do what God has told them to do. However, they haven't. It's obvious at the end of Joshua that they need to continue to be faithful to God. In the book of Joshua, as you've read it, you've seen that they've been tempted to idolatry. That's part of the reason why they have to conquer each of these nations that are in the land of Canaan. Because if they don't conquer them fully, God knows that they're going to fall into idolatry. They're going to stop serving the Lord, and they're going to start serving other gods. And so Joshua says, I'm about to die. Choose this day whom you're going to serve. Either choose to serve God or choose to serve the God of your fathers, the idols that are in the land of Canaan. Now, verse 16, the people answer and they say, "Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. For it is the Lord our God who brought us and our fathers up from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, and who did those great signs in our sight, and preserved us in all the way that we went, and among all the peoples through whom we passed. And the Lord drove out before us all the peoples, the Amorites who lived in the land. Therefore we also will serve the Lord, for he is our God." Okay, so Israel answers and said, okay, we're going to serve the Lord. He brought us out of Egypt. He's given us the land. We're going to serve him. But then look at verse 19. This is Joshua 24, verse 19. "But Joshua said to the people, you are not able to serve the Lord, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive you your transgressions or your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do you harm and consume you after having done you good." Okay, so the people say, okay, we're going to serve the Lord. And Joshua says, no, you can't serve the Lord. You're going to turn and you're going to serve idols. This is a prophecy of what's to come. Joshua is saying, Israel, you can't serve the Lord. And we've already seen this in Genesis through Deuteronomy and even partly in Joshua. That when God brought the Israelites out of Egypt, they immediately started grumbling and complaining. They began to question the Lord. When they were at Mount Sinai and when they received the law, they started worshiping the golden calf. We saw last week in Numbers that they began to worship idols, to grumble and complain against the Lord, to rebel against the Lord. So we've already seen that Israel, even at its inception, has difficulty and in fact finds it impossible to obey. And again, we saw this in Joshua a little bit. We saw it with Achan. If you've read Joshua, hopefully you're keeping up with your reading. Achan was not able to obey. He rebelled against the Lord. We've seen it in a couple of other places in Joshua where Israel doesn't obey. And now Joshua says, you're not going to choose the Lord. He's told them to choose the Lord. He's encouraged them to choose the Lord. But then at the end, he says, you know what? You're not going to obey. And this is what we find in the book of Judges. Now again, just like the rest of the Old Testament, the author is formally anonymous. It may have been Samuel, who is the last of the judges. We're not sure about that. Um, but the book of Judges follows immediately on the book of Joshua, and it talks about Israel's failure to obey. So Joshua says, choose this day whom you're going to serve. Israel says, we're going to choose God. But Joshua says, no, you're going to disobey. You're not going to obey. And that's exactly what happens in the book of Judges. We see in the first chapter of Judges that Israel fails to conquer the land. There in verse 27, it says of chapter 1 of Judges, it says, Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth-shean and its villages, or to Anak and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, etc., etc., etc. Verse 29, Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites. Verse 30, Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron. Verse 31, Asher did not drive out. Verse 33, Naphtali did not drive out. And verse 34, the Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country. Okay, so what happens is Israel fails to do what God told them to do. And in chapter 2, God responds. And he responds to their idolatry by raising up judges. Now, you see here on your slide this cycle, okay, this cycle right here of sin, oppression, and deliverance. What happens is that the children of Israel do evil. Because of their sin, God is angry. He sends an oppressor of some nation, some foreign nation, to punish Israel for that evil. However, during this oppression, Israel cries out to the Lord, and the Lord hears their cry and raises up a deliverer, also called a judge. And then this deliverer quells the enemy, and we see a period of peace followed by the death and burial of that judge. Okay, so what happens is Israel sins, they don't conquer, they fall into idolatry, something. God sends an oppressor, a foreign nation, to oppress Israel. Israel cries out, and God sends a judge and a deliverer who quells the enemy and then then dies and is buried during this period of peace. And this happens over and over and over again. So as you read the book of Judges, you're going to see this cycle. That's basically the outline of Judges. And what we see is that as Israel continues to fall into sin, the situation only gets worse. They fall into sin that is worse and worse. Okay, so by the end, the priests and also the tribe of Benjamin are doing horrendous things in Judges chapter 20 and 21. And God continues to send deliverers. God continues to save Israel. So we see both Israel's inability to obey, but also God's faithfulness to save Israel. What's happening is Joshua has shown them that they're not going to be able to obey. Judges confirms that. Judges shows us that Israel will continue in sin until until they finally are able to obey, which we don't see that happening in the near future. But the book of Judges also shows us that God is faithful and mighty to save. He is continually able to send a deliverer to save Israel, not only from the oppressor, but also from their own sin. He's able to help them obey. And what Judges points to is the need for somebody to come and help Israel to obey. Israel needs the ability to obey. They don't have it in themselves. The people of God don't have it with them inside of them. They're not able to obey. And so what Judges shows us is that Israel needs not only somebody to deliver them from the foreign nations, but also somebody to help them to obey. And in Deuteronomy chapter 30, which we didn't go over last week in class, but Deuteronomy 30 promises the new covenant, when people will have new hearts and new spirits that will be able to obey. Okay, and so this is what Judges is a dark book. The Israelites don't obey very well, but the book of Judges, sort of in a negative way, helps us to remember that the people of Israel, the people of God, need new hearts and new spirits so that they can obey. And that again points us to the one who will bring that promise of Deuteronomy 30 and then later Ezekiel 37, Jeremiah 31, the promise of the new covenant, that God is going to bring somebody who will give his people new hearts. And we know from the New Testament that's Jesus. So we've just done the book of Judges. We'll continue with